Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, The Abyss, Addiction, Homelessness, and Trauma. I'm Caroline Gumpenberger, and I will be the moderator for the webinar, which is presented by the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council and the Cold Spring Center for Social and Health Innovation, with support from the Health Resources and Services Administration, Office of National Assistance and Special Populations. This session is being recorded. This is a 90-minute presentation with the last 30 minutes reserved for Q&A. There is a chat box below the presentation slides for participant questions and technical issues. Please type your questions or technical issues into the chat box at any time during the presentation. A select number of questions will be answered at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. Remaining questions will be logged and provided to the presenter for written responses after the webinar. If you are having technical issues, you may also call the Council's office at 615-226-2292 and speak with Alyssa Curtis, who will assist you. Our presenter once again today is Matt Bennett, Chief Innovation Officer at the Cold Spring Center for Social and Health Innovation. Matt specializes in the development of trauma-informed care, quality improvement, and results-based leadership and clinical practices. As a dynamic trainer, Matt's expertise has taken him around the country speaking on topics such as trauma, leadership, quality improvement, motivational interviewing, and resiliency. Thank you, and now we'll turn it over to Matt.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back. I know most of you have probably been or watched the last two webinars. If you're new to this, welcome. My job, I will try not to bore anybody who's been through the last two with a lot of revisions while making sure I don't lose anybody who might be joining us for the first time. So welcome back for most of you. Welcome for the first time to some of you. Let's get rolling. So just a reminder, these are sort of our goals for the overarching four-part series. Again, we're going to continue our journey today really to understand the impact of trauma and neurobiology on the understanding of homelessness. How does this, the impact of biology really and trauma really sets folks up to struggle with things like addiction, struggle in education, struggle in the employment environment, and often, too often, leads to homelessness. Utilize this knowledge to really help those and meet the needs of those experiencing homelessness. One of the things I get really excited about with the trauma-informed care research is that it's really showing us what folks need at a very deep level, what they need through resources, support, medical care, all these different aspects. And again, we'll dig deeper into that today and build upon what we've learned in the first two sessions. The final thing is a goal that I'd like to just put back out there is to really start to utilize this knowledge in our own advocacy to end homelessness. One of those things that I get very excited about with this topic is we understand addiction in a whole different way than I was taught 10 or 15 years ago. We have an understanding of the relationship of trauma and addiction, and to me, it just explains why it's so difficult for people to kick addiction and also why people can fall into addiction so easily. And so hopefully this will continue to give you some language to use in your own advocacy as well. We're after today, at least we'll be 3/4 the way of this series. This is sort of the low point in our journey. And so we're going to talk about some dark stuff when we talk about trauma, when we talk about addiction, homelessness, but hopefully we'll get this understanding that then we can work with on November 2nd to talk about how do we help folks truly heal and recover and experience that post-traumatic growth that we hope for all of our folks who have been through a lot of trauma, chronic homelessness, addiction, abuse, all these things that we know so many people, our patients and our clients walk through the door with in their own experience. How do we help transform that into a growth experience for folks? With the abyss and homelessness, what we're going to look at today is really this relationship between trauma and addiction, and really looking at how do we understand addiction in the face of trauma. We want to utilize these models, again, hopefully give you some language to communicate this with your teammates, with your communities, and then again, really able to explain that science behind the addiction. Again, I'm going to talk for 60 minutes straight, which those that know me know I have no problem doing that. And then we'll have 30 minutes for questions at all. If you have any questions as we go through as well, please feel free to type those. I know last time we didn't get those in time, and there were a few questions. So as we go along, if you have something, just throw it in that question box, and that'll allow us to really spend that 30 minutes really digging into those as well. I want to go back to the title slide here because I think that this question really changed my whole perspective on addiction, and it comes from one of my favorite authors, Gabriel Maté, who's written a really good book, if you haven't picked it up, The Realm of Hungry Ghosts. Basically, as I like to say, if you're on this call, it's a book you need to pick up. Just a brilliant book. He runs the Portland House in Vancouver, Canada, a very harm reduction approach, a housing program. He's the medical doctor at this housing program, serving folks with usually long-term addiction, HIV, and chronic homelessness. And so really speaks to specifically the population that I know most of you serve on as well. And so when we talk about, the question is never why the addiction, but why the pain. I want you to hold on to that question as we go through today, because I hope at the end the answer or the reason behind this change will become very evident to us. Okay, the impact of stress and trauma. So just sort of looking at this, and in this section I really want to set up the biological foundation for which addiction can take hold. And so I want to dig a little deeper, building upon what we talked about in the last two webinars, to really dig and understand why stress, why trauma really sets up a biological state that's so vulnerable to addiction. One of the things is bringing trauma into this is this concept of attachment to pain and suffering. And this is something I thought a lot about. One of my nerdy hobbies that I have is I like to read about historical approaches to healing, whether that's medical healing, psychological healing, spiritual healing. We didn't used to separate these as much into separate categories. And one of a lot of the shamanic traditions talk about how trauma, pain, and suffering really attach itself to the body in different ways. And it's like, it reminds me of this dog that I used to dog sit named Monty. And I always loved to dog sit Monty because Monty's dad or owner was a drug rep and had a condo up in the mountains. And, you know, with my wife being a teacher, me doing what I do, we will never be able to afford a condo in the mountains. But our drug rep friends got condos in the mountains. So the deal was we would go up and dog sit Monty, and we would get to stay in the condo and be right next to the ski resort for a long weekend. And Monty was a golden retriever, and we'd take her out. She loved going out in the snow, but because of her soft fur, the snow would just stick to her. And at the end of playing with her or going on a hike or snowshoeing, there would be this 45-pound dog with about 35 pounds of snow just attached to her all over. And that really reminds me and really is a visual for me to think about a lot of the folks we work with that have just had one traumatic experience after another, without the ability to truly release these traumatic experiences, free ourselves from the post-traumatic stress reactions, the re-traumatization, the nightmares, the pain that trauma causes. It really sticks to us and wears us down. And again, this really sets up the piece for addiction. The other thing is that we see this disconnection from self, others, and spirit. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go forward. But trauma can be, again, trauma without that healing experience. I always want to keep that on our minds. We're talking about folks that haven't had a chance to fully recover. They're still living in the hell. They haven't had a chance to say, I wouldn't go back to that hell, but I'm stronger today for having gone through it. They're still in that pain and suffering. And they lose a sense of self. They lose the connection to other people. And one of the things that we don't often speak enough of, but I see so often too, is really a disconnection from spirit, from faith, from their own spirituality. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go on today too. Phil Casino is a great author, and he talks a lot. He was a student of Joseph Campbell. People are familiar with him. And he talks about the journey of the individual, and he has something he calls the understory. And I love this quote. It's the invisible movement of the soul through the journey. And when trauma is a part of our reality, when we grow up in struggling households, in poverty, in homelessness, maybe a parent struggling with addiction or mental illness, those ACEs that we talked about, trauma, I see it as a thief, and it steals away a good, healthy story of our self-relationships in the world. And I want to dig into that in a little bit greater detail here. When we talk about ourselves, we're left oftentimes, trauma makes us feel unworthy, and we get this sense of shame about ourselves. I was struggling with, because none of the stuff that we're going to talk about really in this section is something that's going to show up concretely on an intake or the initial assessment. These are deeper psychological things we're talking about. I've never had a client, whether it was therapy or case management, come up to me and say, you know, I just don't feel worthy of the services you're providing. And so I was struggling to figure out the shame and worthiness piece and how this keeps folks stuck. And I often tell the story about my 2001 Subaru Forester. That sucker had 185,000 miles on it. And I say it had because last week I just bought a new Nissan Leaf, which I'm really nerding out about. So I had to say goodbye to my Subaru. But this great car that I had for so long was just falling apart. And the great thing about Subarus is they would always start. So I never felt, you know, if you're in our professions, you get more excited about not having a car payment than a fancy new car. But this car was just sort of falling apart, and one day I opened the door and the speaker just fell out of the door. And it was just kind of dangling there like, I guess, an eyeball falling out of a socket looked like in the movies. And I had this thought process. I was like, okay, what's this going to cost to fix? And I thought for a second, I was like, well, you know, I could probably spend 20 minutes online. I don't really buy auto parts that much, but I'm sure I could find a used part online. Might take 20 minutes to do, maybe $20, $30 at most. Maybe I could take it in next time I go to the oil change at the Subaru place. I'm sure they would have a replacement part, and maybe that would cost me $50. And I had this thought, is it worth that effort to fix my car? And by that time, I found myself walking in, getting the duct tape, and once again, duct taping something together that had fallen apart in my 2001 Subaru Forester. You know, rest in peace. But this really taught me, and in no way am I comparing any human being to my 2001 Subaru Forester, but it really started to get me thinking about all those folks that I served that just didn't seem to see themselves worthy of the services that we had, the resources we had. Sometimes, a lot of times, I just had this feeling that they didn't feel worthy of being in even a relationship with somebody that truly cared about them. There's always this sort of anxiety around that. And one of the things I realized as again, I used my car, I was thinking about this and it gave me that insight, is they don't see themselves as worthy. That there's this shame that goes along with trauma that really keeps us stuck. Like Monty the dog was weighed down by this experience. And this really, when I started to think about this, I realized even though they wouldn't tell me I just don't feel worthy of living this fulfilled life, really thinking about my future, the thing where I did see this manifested is over and over these kids, young adults I'd work with, when we would talk about the abuse that they experienced, and most of the kids I've worked with experienced severe trauma in their life, what I heard over and over is, it's my fault that I was abused. I deserved it. And if you've ever been in this situation having these conversations, it is absolutely heartbreaking to hear this kid in no logical way could you justify their words. No kid deserves this, and yet that's what they've internalized over time. And this is where trauma on a personal level really gets us stuck. There's also a loss of autonomy. This is going to play in big with addiction as well. And we know through the science around the brain and neurobiology is that we operate a lot on automatic pilot. And when we talk about automatic pilot, I like to bring in the concept of the triad of unconscious motivation. And if we're mindful and we say, okay, what do I want for my future? What decision in this moment is going to lead me to the goals I want to do? We can, as human beings, really make great existential decisions. But what we know now through the research is the majority of time that we're living our life, we're living it in an unconscious way. The power of unconscious for most of us, because we've experienced this, is that if you've ever driven and commuted to work, you park your car, you get out of your car, and you don't remember anything about the commute itself. That shows you how powerful our unconscious is. Just think about the complexity of driving through rush hour traffic and commuting to work. It's dangerous. Some of us are driving at high rates of speed. There's people on cell phones. We're communicating with strangers non-verbally who we've never met before, and yet our unconscious can get us there safely most of the time. So our brain loves habits, because habits like driving to work the same way every day is a more efficient way for our brain to operate than if I had to think, okay, I need to make a left turn here, a right turn here, a left turn here. And so habits allow our brain to act more efficiently. And really you can think about our brain as programmed to do what it did the day before, and the day before. And that's an important thing to think about as we go into addiction. The other two things is that we seek pleasure and avoid pain. So again, we want, and too often we think about the folks experiencing homelessness, addiction, is that they wake up every day and choose to stay in this condition. And the reality is, if that's what they've known, and that's what they've done the day before, some folks for decades, they're not waking up in the morning and say, okay, am I going to go get a job today, or am I going to stay unemployed, stay living out on the streets, continue to use? There's not that existential crisis until they engage in services, and we offer them different options to give them a lot of support. We'll talk more about that next week when we talk about the healing thing. But there is really a loss of autonomy on a biological level as well. This is the picture of the brain that we use to describe that B road, or the high road that goes up through the cortex into the prefrontal cortex. That's where we make strategic decisions. And as we talked about, when we talked about the impact of trauma on the brain, what we see through functional MRIs and brain scans is that there's less activation in the prefrontal cortex for folks experiencing trauma. We'll talk about how addiction even furthers that lack of activation. So in many ways, you can think about the things that folks need to make a different choice to say, okay, today I'm going to go see my case manager instead of use. Today I'm going to get up and I'm going to go to the job training program, or I'm going to go to the GED class, or whatever it is, and not continue some of those old patterns. We need a high level of activation in the prefrontal cortex. And again, we know that that's not impossible for people experiencing trauma. We have plenty of examples to show it can happen. But without a lot of help and support, unfortunately, it continues to go down that A road. And again, if I'm living in dangerous situations like homelessness, or even shelter situations or other things where I'm just surviving, I'm going to spend a lot of time on that A road, the low road, the short road, and I'm going to be more of that hyper-aroused on that edge of the window of tolerance in the fight or flight response. I just want you to walk away that it's hard. The traumatized brain is going to find it really hard to change behaviors because of the biological structure of the brain. And again, we'll build on this with the addiction piece as we go forward. The final piece with self here is a sense of feeling unsafe in the world. And this again is something that nobody told me, but when I started to really think about it and saw the research, it made a lot of sense. And I really wish somebody would have come along in all my education I had in psychology and told me this very simple thing, is that no client wakes up in the morning wanting to get kicked out of my programs, wanting to be a behavioral problem, wanting to get arrested, wanting to relapse back into substance use. But what we know is because our folks have struggled so much with some of their own behaviors and their own emotional regulations, is that so many folks are walking around not trusting themselves. And we know this leads to a really high level of anxiety and actually can reinforce and keep people out of their window of tolerance because they're so concerned that they're going to get kicked out of just one more clinic, one more case management organization. So this sense is that I'm not safe in the world. And so this is the story of the self. And again, trauma is really a narrative thief and steals that positive view of self in the world. Relationships are also damaged by traumatic experience. One of the things that we know that's so devastating about trauma is most of the trauma that we're talking about is a person in power, whether they have social power, physical power, economic power, abusing or neglecting somebody with less power. A lot of times that's a parent-child, family member, something like that. And then, so what happens, especially if the dysfunction is in the home environment with the parental figures, is that through attachment wiring in our brain, we start to build these attachment templates. And I know probably everybody on this call has heard about that fabulous, amazing, secure attachment, which means that we're connected heavily. We love our caregivers. We feel safe with them. They create a secure base for us. So we can start to, as we grow up and go from being a baby to walking, we can go explore the world because we know we have a safe base back with our parents, or that secure base. Unfortunately, for so many people growing up in unsafe homes or homes that are struggling, they aren't ever able to establish that secure base. So instead, they have attachment templates where they're anxious around relationships, where they're very avoidant of getting close to people for afraid they're going to get hurt again, or what's called disorganized attachment, which even though it's only 10% of the overall population have a disorganized attachment, we know that that's much higher represented in people experiencing homelessness, people in the criminal justice system. So unfortunately, growing up in these environments, people learn not to trust others. People learn that others are a source of pain. And what our brain does really well, at a lot of times for our benefit, but at this time for our detriment, is that if this person caused me pain, and especially if this person in power caused me pain, why won't the next person? Why won't you also take advantage of me and hurt me? And you add this, their parental experience, their experience in their home. You also put on maybe interactions with police officers, interactions with other parts of the healthcare system. I know I asked the question in many of my trainings is, how many people would say that the majority of folks on their caseload or that they see have actually been abused by the system? And the vast majority of folks all around the country say yes to that answer. So again, we walk into all of those templates. So this is why it takes a little bit more work to establish trust in a working relationship, because what we're doing is we're trying to challenge those templates that all people are bad. Relationships also become about survival. And I haven't got my language exactly. I don't feel too articulate about this. So I ask some leeway from you with this because I think it's an important concept, and I don't want to be demeaning or not strength-based about it. But what I really realized is I used to use this terminology, which I no longer use except to state it here in trainings, is that entitled client. And I think most of you know what I mean when I'm talking about the entitled client. The give me. And for my caseload, a lot of times that happens at 3:30 on a Friday, right? Somebody you haven't seen for 6 months shows up, they're ready for permanent housing, they're ready for a medical appointment. Everything that you wanted to give them all along, you didn't even know if they were alive or dead. They walk in and they want it all on a Friday afternoon, and you don't know if you have enough time to get it to them, and you need them to come back Monday to give the housing program, and then sometimes they never show up. But there's sort of this all-or-nothing piece of relationships when we talk about trauma. And especially when you think about addiction and managing an addiction and living in homelessness, extreme poverty, everything really becomes about survival. So people also become about getting those basic needs met, of food, of shelter. And if you're suffering or trying to manage an addiction, you're also, that seems like a life and death thing as well. And so really looking at out on the street, life is a hustle. And we can't expect them, this was a good lesson for me to kind of come to this realization, to drop that mentality when they walk into our services. And so when we feel this entitlement coming out, this is just the relational templates that they often use to survive on the street. And if we're really honest about it, and we think about all of us also do this to some extent, is, you know, the woman down at Safeway a couple of blocks away from my house where I buy my groceries really keeps me alive in a lot of ways. I don't grow my own food. I don't harvest my food. I don't process my food. I go to the store and buy it, and the nice person at the checkout gives me substance so I can feed myself. In many ways, I've realized how lucky and fortunate I am to actually have friends in my life that I just like to hang around, that I don't have to worry about meeting my basic needs, so I can just enjoy other people. And so for those that are always living in those low levels of Maslow's hierarchy, when they're worried about safety, security, those basic needs, relationships too can become about survival. And when they walk into services, that can seem very demanding, underappreciated, all these things. It's just that mentality that often keeps them alive out on the street. So again, my language isn't great around that, but I think it's an important topic for us to internalize so we avoid putting one more label on our folks. Judith Herman, who wrote one of the really early great books on trauma, has this quote that really sums it up. The core experience of psychological trauma are disempowerment and disconnection from others. So with this negative view of self and relationship, the world becomes what I like to call the abyss. And so the abyss, a few different definitions here. A region of hell conceived as a bottomless pit. And for me, even though this is maybe a little over top on the drama piece, you know, when I've worked with folks, especially in experiencing chronic homelessness and addiction, they've just fallen so far. And you feel that sometimes when you're with folks that just haven't experienced hope in a long time. And this just helps me remind me I still need to meet them where they're at. And if that's, for some folks, that's a pretty dark spot. Again, we're going to talk about how there is hope for everybody and how we can give folks life. Spiritual and emotional death. Again, I think the spiritual side of this is often overlooked, but I think it's so key and important. With Healthcare for the Homeless at the national conferences and also regional conferences that I've been allowed to be a part of over the years, I have this group of heroes, I call them, and they're folks that are consumers or ex-consumers, and all their faces just pop into my head when I think about these guys. A lot of them are on the Consumer Advisory Board of the National Council. These folks that are just have this amazing power, and they were living on the streets. They were struggling with a lot of them, their own substance use, and so on and so forth, all the struggles that the folks work with, and they're giving back to their community. And I always take the opportunity to ask these folks, why are you here today? What helped you get off the street and now be in a position to give back to your community? And the number one answer I get, and this varies depending on where I'm at geographically, but for the most part it's pretty concrete. It's Jesus and a case manager, Jesus and a nurse, Jesus and a therapist, Jesus and a physician. Somebody came along that cared about them in their life and they got connected back to their spirituality. And what they said is a lot of times when they're in this abyss, they lost connection to any healthy relationships, including their relationships with a higher power. And I just think it's an important thing that a lot of people lose that connection when they're in the darkness of the abyss. And this was another definition that I found just nailed it as well. A wide and profound difference between people. Again, that's that disconnection. And so this is the darkness of trauma, especially when we talk about chronic homelessness and putting addiction on top of this. And so when we talk about the impact of this, one of the things that we know when we talked about trauma being the public health issue of our time is chemically what trauma does is it really increases the experience of psychological and physical pain. And again, we now know that psychological pain and physical pain are processed very similarly in the brain. When I think about folks experiencing chronic pain, and I think about how much psychological pain they're coming in with as well, I think it explains just this high, real feeling of pain that our folks are experiencing. And then what we know with trauma and living in this for a sustained period of time without that healing opportunity, what we know is it decreases open dopamine and endorphin receptors on our neurons. So you can think about each neuron or brain cell has all these receptors on it to soak up neurotransmitters, and dopamine and endorphin are two of these. So if in a normal functioning brain, if we're doing something that makes us feel good, like after a good workout, after great sex, after a good fun night out, whatever it is that our system gets flooded with dopamine and endorphins. And a normal brain will kind of suck those up as a vacuum cleaner. And that accounts for some of the really good experiences that we feel. We know folks that have had trauma have less of these receptors open. This accounts biologically for the high rates of depression experienced by this community. So just if you're not familiar with dopamine and endorphins, just to put some pieces of the puzzle here, dopamine is basically something that makes us feel good. And when we feel good about something, we want more of it. I always use the example, and it's getting to be late October in Colorado, so even though it's like 80 degrees and sunny today, we're all really getting excited because the first ski resort opened, A-Basin opened this week. So this is the time of year where I, being a cheap guy who doesn't like to spend his money, I have to struggle with spending all this money on a ski pass so I can go snowboarding. But every year I end up doing it because something about being up in the mountains on a beautiful day, going really fast down a mountain on a glorified piece of cardboard just makes me smile. And because I release that dopamine every time I go up snowboarding, I can't wait to get on my board and get some snow under it this year. So we're pulled towards people and things that release dopamine and make us feel good. Again, we want more of it. Endorphins, again, a lot of us are really familiar on this, especially with the opiate epidemic that's going on. But these are the natural opiates that we produce within our body. These help decrease pain, and they also impact our bonding with other people. So endorphins, after a really good run, this is sort of that good feeling that we have. As we release these endorphins, we feel less pain, and we actually feel better and more connected to other people. So again, when we look at the triad, and now let's look at this from the point of addiction. So addiction, energy efficiency, avoid pain, and seek pleasure. And one of the things that I really want to do is normalize why someone might pick up and use, get high or get drunk when they're holding on to this psychological pain. Because I believe if we can destigmatize the initial use, we can see how addiction is almost the natural outcome of this beginning use. And so on the energy efficiency piece of it, I believe so many of our folks know what lies ahead of them if they're really going to address their trauma, the homelessness, the addiction. There's, therapy, mindfulness, medical appointments. We have all these resources, but I think for so many people, it seems overwhelming. It seems, they may want to get over it, but coming to me as a therapist and talking about all the shit just seems overwhelming. So when we talk about a quick and easy way to kill pain, getting high or getting drunk is incredibly efficient. Now, again, medium to short term, there are some really negative outcomes associated with it. So I'm not saying it's a great way to kill traumatic pain, but it's an incredibly efficient and in some ways a very cheap way to kill pain, again, at least initially. The other pieces I want to spend the most time with here is to avoid pain and seek pleasure. And with any concept about addiction, we have to talk about self-medicating. And this really is, we are great as human beings at self-medicating. I know several of you are probably listening to this in a medical clinic, and yet if you get a headache from me yelling at you for 60 minutes, you probably, even though there may be a physician or a nurse sitting right next to you, you're probably not going to go seek out medical advice on what you should do about a little headache. You will probably reach into your purse, your drawer, mine's in my briefcase, grab a couple of leaves, take it, and hope the leaf gets rid of my voice ringing in your ears. And we are really great at self-medicating. I had the opportunity to go train in New Orleans, and I was right off Bourbon Street, and there's plenty of temptation as far as drinking, at least, in that area of our country. And so here I am on Bourbon Street. Of course, I'm looking for a healthy, one of those naked shakes, green machine shakes for breakfast in the morning. And so I walked into a Walgreens, couldn't find the green machine shake, but on the way to my freezer, I had the opportunity to walk through the medicine aisle. And we all know it, right? There are thousands, it just struck me, of thousands of ways to kill what's ailing you, right? There's things for cramps, for diarrhea, for like headaches. There's like, I counted them one day, there's like 45 different ways to kill a headache. Every pain that you might have, there was an option of about 20 drugs to kill that pain. Since I was in New Orleans, the next thing I walked was a fully stacked liquor store getting back to the cabinet. And it kind of just struck me that for every way there was to kill a headache, boy, there was just a different flavor of vodka. So you had 45 ways to kill a headache. You had 45 different flavors of vodka to choose as well. And it just struck me sort of the similarities between those two. And so when we feel pain, we don't stay in that pain very often. We look for ways to get out of it. I just throw this study up about Manhattan after the 9/11 attacks because, again, I know that there's poverty in Manhattan, but overall it's a fairly wealthy zip code. And if you look at just what these folks did to deal with the trauma that their community experienced, we see a dramatic increase in substance use, alcohol intake, additional drink a day, sales skyrocketed. So I think it's fair to say, and I just again want to normalize that a lot of times we will seek out drugs to deal with the impact of stress. Again, this is somewhat a normal human response for so many of us. The problem is that a lot of these drugs also increase all those symptoms that we talked about that happen from trauma. So trauma and substances really exacerbate all the symptoms, the medical issues such as cancer, when we talk about higher rates of smoking, heart disease, diabetes, stroke, all these things. When you throw substances and trauma together, again, it increases the chance for those public health issues, the disease, but also increases the experience of the symptoms of those diseases as well. So I just want to play a quick video here. Again, this is my attempt to really normalize why someone might start to pick up a drug. And this video, I think, does a great job. This isn't something that's just shown at 11 o'clock at night. It was shown all throughout the day during football games. But I just want you to see the societal message that this video sends. So I'll let them play this. I just want to see if you can pick this out.
Let's have a conference call over the weekend.
Great idea.
You're going to need to be home between 10 and 6.
An operator will be with you in 34 minutes.
Yeah, we're going to have to keep it in the shop till Monday.
You know that show I was telling you about? I got 2 tickets. I'm so excited.
So there it is, right? If you see somebody, not anything traumatic there. His girlfriend got Riverdance tickets. That's seems like the most traumatic thing about that video. But after all this stress that's going on at work with his car, with his girlfriend, he runs across the street. There's an attractive group of people, and his friend, his buddy, hands him a drug. And now he's found his beat. So again, we're sort of told I think we are told from a very young age that drugs are really good when we're stressed out. Not that any of us, after a hard week at work, will go to this thing, at least in Denver, we have this thing called happy hour, which is incredibly well placed after a hard day of work, where you can usually go get some really bad-for-you food and drinks as well. And so it's just something that's sort of ingrained in us, and also society sort of makes it easy to do that as well. So when we look at the 3 factors of addiction, this is where the connection with trauma really became very strong for me in my research. The first factor is we need a susceptible organism, and really this is all of us. Some of us on this call may be predisposed genetically to have a higher rate of addiction? The answer to that is yeah, kind of. But if you think about epigenetics and the mixture of the environment and our genetic potential, I think if we randomly selected 10 people that are on this call and did their full genome, we could probably rank them from 1 to 10 as the person that's 10 is probably most at risk. The person at 1 is probably least at risk. But if we took the number 3 on the list, so that their likelihood genetically is not very high, but that person was raised in a family that had addiction, alcoholism, or drug abuse in the home. Maybe they were struggling with poverty, housing instability, and the family was really struggling. And we took number 8, and 8 was raised in a very supportive home where there wasn't any drug abuse going on. They had success in school. They had a lot of these good things going on. Would number 3, raised in their sort of dysfunctional, struggling environment, be at a higher risk than number 8? Possibly. And so, again, we just can't separate the environment from the genetic code. I like to say if everybody on this call started to use heroin today for the next 30 days, we would probably be all addicted to heroin very quickly. So some people may be more at risk, but again, it's hard to pull that away from the environmental factors when we look at the epigenetic research. We need a drug or behavior with an addictive potential. Some drugs are more addictive with others, but anything that really floods ourselves with dopamine can become addictive over time. This is the one that really opened my eyes, and the third factor of addiction is stress. And as we talked about in the first training, trauma is just a very intense form of stress. There's this really well-known study done with Vietnam vets returning home, and when they did the assessment of folks returning back from Vietnam, 20% or 1 in 5 of vets returning home met the clinical criteria for addiction while they were in Vietnam. And at the time, public health officials were freaking out because this was tens of thousands of people coming back from this war that were going to be addicted. And how were our system going to handle this amount of people coming back with their addictions? When you took away the stress and the trauma of Vietnam, only 1% remained addicted once they got home. And one of the justifications, and I give this some credence, is, well, in Vietnam there was a lot of opium, there was just a lot of heroin, drugs were sort of very available, and when they got home to everyday USA, there wasn't that availability. I buy that to an extent, but if you needed to kill psychological pain, there was probably a liquor store in your town, and this was the 60s and 70s, so you could probably at least get some marijuana and maybe some harder stuff like prescription pills as well. So even though I think that is a factor here, I don't think it totally explains this 95% remission rate. The really interesting thing when you looked at this 1% is that a lot of this 1% that remained addicted had past childhood trauma in their lives. So we see this combination of past childhood, those ACEs we talked about, combined with the trauma of Vietnam, and their addiction held and kept hold of them when they came back. And so just some really interesting fascination. But when you think about stress and you think about homelessness, discrimination, domestic violence, all those things that our folks are experiencing, again, this is what's setting up this biological environment to have that addiction take hold. I want to talk about a little bit more of the science with this, especially going back to those endorphin and dopamine receptors that we brought up. So we talked about how trauma, often manifesting itself as depression, will shut down in that biological environment impacted by trauma the number of dopamine and endorphin receptors open on the brain cells or neurons. So I'm not able to enjoy life. Again, that accounts for that depressive state. And so when we take this into addiction, I want to, and this is some dirty science here because we have no idea how many receptors that a normal person has open. Even when they talk about neurons, it's like stars in the skies and pebbles of sand on the beach. We're talking numbers that are just huge when we talk about the number of neurons and much less the individual receptors on those neurons. But so some dirty science to prove a point, though. I think this helps me think about trauma. Is let's say that there's a life satisfaction scale. And at the top, if you answered 100, that means you were in love with every moment of your life. You got up in a good mood. You went to sleep in a good mood. Even your hard days seemed fun and challenging. You know, you may know somebody like this. They're probably on some kind of substance of some sort. But this person is just annoyingly happy. And again, so that would be 100. If somebody said I would rank 100 on that scale, that would be that if you're 0, you're too depressed to even get out of bed in the morning. The world just seems dark and miserable, and you can't find the energy to get up. So I want to use, again, just to throw a little what I like to call dirty science in here to prove a point. Let's say we have 2 people, and let's say we'll call them Bob and Tom just to make it simple. And let's say Tom, if you ask Tom on a general day how happy you are with life, he would say that he's an 80. And I'm going to just say, again, this is where the dirty science comes in, that a score of 80 on Matt's life satisfaction scale means that he has 80 trillion endorphin and dopamine receptors open. So, again, that is in no way scientifically based, but it'll help me show how addiction can take hold. And so he's an 85. And so that's Bob. Tom, on the other hand, he's somebody that we know all too well, somebody experiencing housing instability, unemployment, difficulty connecting and establishing and maintaining healthy relationships, really struggling in a lot of ways. And if you asked Tom what his life satisfaction was, he would say, you know, I'm probably a 20 on most days. And so, again, in my dirty science, let's say he has 20 trillion receptors open. Again, because of his past trauma, current stress, he doesn't have as many of those receptors open. So we have Bob's 85, Tom's at 20. Now, Bob and Tom, let's say they both end up at the same party one day. Neither of them have used cocaine, but somebody brings cocaine out at the party, and both of them decide that they're going to try cocaine for the first time. So Bob, who's normally of 85, he gets high, and if you could slow him down long enough to ask him what he feels like right now, he may say, you know, I'm probably about a 91. You know, I'm wide awake. I feel like dancing. I'm really having a blast. I'm ready to go. This is fun. You know, so he's having a good time. So he's usually an 85. He boosts up to a 91. Now, he wakes up the next day, and I've never done cocaine, so I'm not sure if there's a big hangover from cocaine, but let's say he's not experiencing any kind of hangover, so he wakes up back at an 85. Now, his motivation to go back out and walk the streets of whatever town he's in to try to find another hit of cocaine is probably not all that high, right? He's experienced 91 when he goes to a concert, when he has a good date, when he hangs out with friends. So even though a 91 was really a good night, it wasn't something that would motivate him to go out and walk the streets seeking another hit of cocaine. Now, let's shift down then to Tom, who has those 20 trillion neurons open. He takes cocaine, and basically there's so much dopamine released in his system that every time one of those receptors gets open, it's just flooded with dopamine. So basically you think of his brain just like a super vacuum cleaner that's sucking up all the dopamine it possibly can. And if you were to ask him at that moment, as he's experienced in his high, how's he feel, he would probably say, you know, I'm feeling like a 65. And, you know, for somebody who's experienced a lot of trauma in their life, they may have never experienced what a 65 feels like before. So this may be what he thought feels normal. His pain's gone away. He feels more social. He can connect with people. He's actually having a good time, which he doesn't have very often. And he is just on cloud 9. It's the best night of his entire life. Again, maybe he's felt what it was like to be a 45 or a 50, but he's never felt that 65. 25 before. So he wakes up the next day back down at 20, and instead of waking up with a 6% gap that Bob did, Tom wakes up with a 40. He's back down at 20. And so with this analogy, I hope you can see that Tom's motivation to go out and use again is incredibly high. So this is why biologically, but also socially, this is why folks struggling with issues like homelessness, unemployment, poverty, if that scale is lower, drugs produce a much higher, much more escalated experience for them in a lot of ways. So let's use this to set up the fall into addiction. Pre-use, that our brain understands at our baseline, that Tom knows that he's a 20 and he should wake up and be a 20 most days of his life. The brain, for some reason, knows where it should be. It's an interesting piece of science that I haven't ever heard really well explained, but the brain knows that, hey, if I'm a 20, I should be at a 20. Now, with repeated use, there's always more dopamine and endorphin in the system than should be there naturally. So what our brain does, again, let's focus on Tom. Tom starts to use each and every day. Well, what happens is his brain knows that something's wrong. The brain knows it's supposed to be at 20, and all of a sudden it's spending most of its time up in the 50s and 60s. And what happens is the brain tries to rectify the situation. So what it does is it starts to shut down the limited number of receptors that are already open, trying to get back to that normal baseline of around 20. Now, here's what happens. As those receptors start to shut down, we experience withdrawal. Now, this is, when you look at the results of withdrawal, this irritability, depressed mood, alienation, extreme fatigue. Now, a great way to have some empathy for what withdrawal feels like, I know nobody on this call has ever felt this, but if you've had a friend that may have been hung over at some point in their life, you know, if you ask that friend who's had a hangover, what's one of the best ways to get over a hangover? Not you, not me, but this friend might say, to have another drink. In Denver, we have a term for this. We call it brunch. And I live close to one of these really good brunch places. And on Saturday or Sunday morning when I'm walking the dog, you know, it's a really crazy scene outside because there's this huge line to get in. And you can tell the people that had a little too much fun the night before because they look like they're in the Walking Dead TV show. They just seem to be hating the life. They wish the Denver sun would just explode. You know, they're really miserable. You can always kind of see, I think it's funny, the one person that either didn't go out or was the designated driver, because they're happy to be alive and everybody else is just wanting to really eat that person's brain. And so these people just need their Bloody Marys. And once they get the Bloody Mary, they start to feel better. Again, this happens to other people, none of us on this call. But that's when we think about withdrawal, the way to get rid of these withdrawal symptoms, there's kind of two options. One, to go through an incredibly painful process to get the drugs out of your system, or to get high again. And so, again, one of the things that we know can make you feel better if you're suffering from a draw is another high. Now, this is where things get dangerous, though, especially we see this a lot with the opiate epidemic, is let's say over time, Bob, again, Tom, he started out with 20 because he's continuing to lose. His brain starts to drop his baseline, and now let's say he's a 15 when he wakes up in the morning with this withdrawal, which translates that he has 15 trillion receptors open. Well, now he still wants to get to that initial high. And so, but now he's starting out at a lower level of receptors open. So he now has to use more and more of the drug to get back up to that 60, 65 level. And it's going to be harder and harder to get there. And this is too often where we see, unfortunately, people overdose. This will age me a little, but it's a term I'll never forget about folks that when I was doing substance abuse 15 or so years ago, when I worked with folks that had done heroin, they would call this chasing the dragon. And if you talk to these folks about what it was like to get high on heroin for the first time, it sounded like the most beautiful, incredible human experience you could ever have. The thing that I was told over and over again is like, take your best orgasm you've ever had times 100, and that's your first hit of heroin. Well, that first hit's amazing, but then the more they did heroin, the number of their endorphin receptors dropped, so they kept trying to chase that high. They used more and more, try to find a stronger batch or strain of heroin to get back to that initial state, and unfortunately so many people we lose to overdose in that search for that initial high. But now, again, those receptors are shutting down, we're using more. And eventually what we see here is this cycle take hold. And this is, I know folks that have worked in this field have probably all heard this, now I just get high to get back up to how I used to feel. And so there's no joy anymore. So as we think about Tom, he's shut down, he's at 15 trillion, but also as his addiction takes hold, the rest of his life is probably not getting better. It's probably also his family's getting fed up with him. He may have gotten fired from his part-time job. He might have got kicked out of the housing program. So on one hand, the receptors in the brain are being shut down due to the biological baseline and the substance use. On the other hand, my life is also falling apart as well, and that will increase senses of depression. And so again, we have this slowly declining baseline that now when I'm down to 10 trillion or 5 trillion, I'm taking a normal dose only gets me back up to a 20. And this is where it just becomes devastating. And so now I'm getting high only to feel okay. What I didn't really realize until I got this research was I heard people say that, and I thought, oh, they get high and feel like I feel today. No, they're getting high, and for so many of them, it's just getting back up to that 20. They're not getting back up to the 70, 75 that I feel on most days. They're just trying to get back up to that 20. So even their normal is not necessarily a happy place in and of itself. And so this really helped me, again, a little bit of dirty science there with a number of neurons, but really helped me put some understanding behind it. So to kind of finish out our time, I want to talk about some of the other damage that we see, especially on human development. So over time, and this really explained to me the phenomena that I would see, and I worked with a lot of teenagers and families early on in my career, and over again, I had this situation where I was sitting with a 17-year-old girl, a 15-year-old boy, and their mom or dad was there with them, and if you closed your eyes, you really couldn't pick out who was the parent and who was the teenager. They both seemed to be kind of 17, 15, 17 years old. And I was like, okay, what's going on with mom? Because why isn't mom acting like a mom like I expect a mom to act? Why is she acting like she's 17 herself? And one of the things that we know is that drugs impact, and also trauma, again, these work hand in hand. That's why it's like adding fuel to the fire with addiction, is this white matter, which increases with age and experience. When we start to use this, stops developing. So I like to think of white matter, it sort of gives us wisdom and expertise as we get older. For those of us that are my age, 41, or a little younger than me, or a lot older than me, you know, really this formulation of white matter is all we got left, you know, with brain science. So I'm really fascinated with this, but the older we get, the more connections, and this white matter really allows our synaptic connections to fire more rapidly. So we can recall certain memories, we can build expertise, and I love the word wisdom because this is all I got left. And so what we know with addiction is it stops the age-related formation of white matter. So if somebody starts to use when they're 16 or 17 years old on a daily basis, they in many ways get stuck in that developmental stage. Now, the other thing that I found just really devastating about this piece of white matter is that this lack of white matter does three key things. It diminishes the ability to make new choices, decreases the ability to learn new things, and difficult adapting to changing circumstances. And I think about, okay, what do you need to kick an addiction? And really it's these three things. You need to change life. You need to make new choices. And yet biologically, due to the trauma we talked about, put this addiction research on top of that, and really we have a brain that's just really programmed to do one thing and one thing well, and that's to use. And that's just the devastation of this. It was a really dark realization, is that the brain, the addicted brain, is really set up to stay addicted in a very powerful way. Again, throwing trauma on that is that devastating piece. The other thing we see here is damage to the gray matter. And the gray matter is sort of what we think about when we think about the brain. It's that, when we see the folds of the prefrontal cortex or the cortex on the outside of the brain, that's what that gray matter is. And what we see is in the cerebral cortex and the prefrontal cortex, actually, if you see somebody who's been using for years, activation will kind of start to look like Swiss cheese. There's real holes within the prefrontal cortex. There's more activation in the amygdala, less energy is getting through that high road that we talked about. So again, when we look at the biological, neurobiological impact of trauma, really when we talk about addiction, it just exacerbates that effect, and again, to devastating degrees. So again, when we expect people, whether it's our policymakers or even sometimes with our own programs, to just amazingly start to make new choices after years of trauma, stress, and addiction, this just really reinforces for me that we have to have so much patience with folks, because we're not just having them change a few synapses in their brain so that they can live a different life. They can get into permanent housing. They can start to gain some sobriety. What we're trying to do is really restructure a brain that's structured almost totally around survival and continued use of drugs. So it just really reinforced me that need for patience. So when I put back up the question or the statement by Dr. Mate here, is the question is never why the addiction, but it's why the pain. And so when we see the numbers, folks that have experienced trauma are 5 times more likely to become addicted. I saw a stat that folks that have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences are 4,333 times more likely to inject drugs than somebody without trauma. And so when we see these huge numbers, this really starts to explain why we see that. Before we get to questions, I got to put you in a much better place to leave this training. And my message is we've just talked about half this story. We've talked about at this point how trauma steals that normal life from us, steals the opportunity to really be our best self, realize our genetic potential in education and employment and relationships. Nobody chooses to be traumatized. But as a result of that traumatic experience, especially if it's complex trauma, dysfunctional family situations, poverty, homelessness, and childhood, there's the suffering and challenges that result from that biological impact. This gets people, again, struggling with education, will oftentimes lead to behaviors that get people in trouble with the criminal justice system, makes it hard to engage in the normal healthcare system. And then we talked about this abyss of spiritual and emotional death, which often also unfortunately includes addiction on top of the trauma. The good news, my friends, is that there is hope for everybody. This is a model, Joseph Campbell calls it the hero's journey. And even when he read mythology about the strongest people that any culture could ever identify, their gods, their saviors, their heroes, that in their lowest moment, there was somebody that came in and helped them see the light of hope. Joseph Campbell calls this the mentor, and mentor translates roughly into the finder of the mind. I like to think about this and put a little different spin on it, is that every hero throughout history, and I hope as we look at the biology of addiction and trauma, you see the struggle to get out of, especially chronic homelessness, but homelessness, generational poverty, all these struggles. It really is a hero's journey. Every card is in many ways stacked against our folks, and yet each and every one of us have proof that they can still win that hand. But we know that with trauma, with addiction, we need somebody to come into that abyss. And maybe it's not the finder of the mind, but it helps the person find themselves again, find the good, find the worth within themselves again, brings that hope into the darkness, that there is chance for a better life. We have housing programs. We have resources that we can help you with. We'll talk about in the next week about the transformation and post-traumatic growth process, where, again, we take that abyss, that hell, and we walk away from it. We transform the suffering into wisdom and strength. And so I don't want you to end on such a depressing note with addiction. Please tune in next week as well as we talk about the post-traumatic growth, our role in that process. And I'm a few minutes over, and I do want to get to your questions. So if you have to jump off the call, I do want to thank you for your time. I know you're all extremely busy. Thanks for letting me yell at you for an hour, and I'd love to hear any questions that you might have.
Thanks so much, Matt. To get our Q&A session started, if you have any more questions for Matt, please go ahead and enter them into the Q&A box now. And to get started with our first question, we have, how can we keep a person engaged and hopeful if they want rehab or affordable housing, but there are no units or beds available?
Advocate for change, which I know is not a short-term solution. That's... And the other thing, my other kind of short answer is make sure you take care of yourself in that situation, because I know nothing burnt me out and it borderline traumatized me more than that. The only answer I have, because that sucks, I just want to throw that out there, and it's, just unethical in communities that's the reality. I know it is in most of our communities, is that keep as much as you can engaged with that person. We'll talk about next time, we'll talk about this in great detail, but even resources are critically important, but they have to be coupled with support as well. So stay connected, acknowledge their frustration. I think it's okay to share your own frustration that this is really terrible that we don't have these resources in the community right now, but stay engaged as much as possible and really keep care of yourself as well, because I know it's a hard thing to just get in the car and shake that off at the end of the day. But that relationship, if you can maintain it, will continue to facilitate the healing process and hopefully keep the person motivated and engaged until that resource opens up. But boy, I feel you, because that's one of the toughest things I've ever had to deal with. So stay engaged, keep the relationship going. That's the best chance to buy yourself some time to hopefully something opening up in the near future.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, can you talk a little bit about how to take a trauma history?
There's different ways in different settings to do this. There's, the life event checklist is one free resource. The Adverse Childhood Experience Survey is another possible one. The thing I ask people to struggle with, because I don't have a real great answer for this, because we already, a lot of us within our intakes, can ask a lot of really hard questions around mental illness, substance abuse, domestic violence. So with our jobs can be really difficult and a difficult balancing act. On one hand, I think it would be great at intake if we did something like a life event checklist, and we got an understanding of what trauma they've experienced, maybe what they've witnessed as well, because that gives us a real nice indication of whether or not we should try to connect them with mental health services. The hard thing about that is that if you don't really have a good relationship built and you open up discussions around trauma without a strong relationship and interpersonal safety build up, you could really re-traumatize somebody and lose them to care. So part of that is a discussion to have internally and to weigh those two things. With healthcare for the homeless providers, I in many ways, if you were to ask me if I was opening a brand new clinic, what I would do to around this assessment issue is I would probably assume that anybody experiencing homelessness is coming in with a history of trauma, because I see homelessness in and of itself as a traumatic event, and occasionally you'll find somebody who's lived a good life for 32 years, loses their job, and all of a sudden experiences homelessness. But that is almost never the case. That's the vast exception. We know that most people, and we just know this through the research, that are walking into HCH clinics, housing programs, these higher levels of services are coming from a history of trauma. So with that exception, what I would do, again, if I was starting a clinic from scratch, is assume that and try to build readiness to get them connected with mental health services. I probably wouldn't do the assessment up front. I would just assume it. Now, what I would like to do if the case is, if you allow me to create the perfect program, is spend a lot of time with the person, build up the relationship, and then, even if I'm not a therapeutic decision, maybe bring up a larger assessment or conversation around trauma. So, again, I don't have a real concrete answer. I think it's something we all need to struggle with. Though, again, if you're on this call and you're an HCH provider, I would say 99-point-some% of the people walking through your door have had complex trauma in their life. So even if you just take that assumption and figure that most folks experiencing homelessness could really benefit from mental health services, I'd rather focus a minute on getting them building motivation to engage in mental health services than spending time doing an assessment that might re-traumatize them. But I am open to counter arguments on that as well. I think that question is great for each and every one of us to have within our clinics or organizational settings. It's a really great question. Again, I've seen well-seasoned or really great case managers be able to pull these off and not re-traumatize people. I also hear stories that people get lost to care. So there's some middle ground, and I think that's different for, in many ways, every professional and their level of comfort bringing up and having these really hard discussions.
Thank you. And our next question is, do we know if the lack of white matter occurs with all addiction or just chemical addictions?
That's a good question. I have a 90% confident answer, but not I don't have a study to throw out there and quote on this, so I want to just put that out there. But I think this is mainly with substance abuse addiction, because the white matter impact is a chemical impact on the brain. Now, I'm trying to think about what there might be some exceptions to that, but that would be an answer I have a lot of confidence in saying. So something like maybe an addiction to video games or internet porn or some sex or some other behavior probably isn't having quite the chemical impact on the white matter that an addiction to methamphetamines, crack cocaine, opiates would have. Now, again, if you're starting out from a place of trauma, you've already got that stressed out biology, so white matter is going to have more trouble performing. And if your addiction is causing more stress on top of the trauma and stress you already have in your life, you could see very similar biological damage. But again, I haven't seen a study where behavioral addiction has the same impact on white matter. But again, when we start putting trauma into the mix and some of the negative consequences from behavioral addiction, we might see similar impacts, though maybe not quite as extreme as we see with those hard drugs that like meth and opiates.
Thanks, Matt. And our next question is it possible that it's not only addiction that contributes to changes in the brain, but also high-stress environments along with nutrient-poor foods that can halt emotional and social maturation?
Yes. So high-stress environment, absolutely. And that's what we really spent a lot of time talking in the first two workshops about. That's where that biology really gets structured initially, and then we set addiction on top of this. I also, a really important thing is with the food piece of it. Especially working with kids in residential settings, there was an extreme amount of research put out around the relationship between healthy foods and behaviors. We see the healthier the diets, and I, working at the time in child welfare, we were feeding these kids crap, to be honest with you. And study after study was coming out to say healthy organic food, things like we know milk and other things can really impact behaviors with a lot of kids, especially kids on the autism spectrum. So the nutritional piece is big there as well. I always think about the nutritional piece. It's the fuel that really our brain operates on. And if you're putting terrible fuel into your car, the car's not going to run as well. So all those mixing together, we could also put pollution in there, poisoning from like lead. All those things can really, again, build upon each other. And so when we look at things like poverty, there's often all these things coming together in a very, very harmful way, and also can be kind of multiplying effects on themselves. So really good point on the nutritional piece. You could also throw in 8 hours of sleep. You could also throw in exercise. Again, a lot of times poverty prevents us from living the healthy lifestyle that we all know that we should live. So that's an excellent point and great question.
Thanks. And our next question is, I see that you have normal life with post-traumatic growth. With post-traumatic growth, don't people who have experienced it see their lives as being better than the normal of the past?
That's a very interesting question. Yes, I would say, and this in some ways just makes the graphic more succinct. I will admit that up front. But when we really, I use here the normal life of really success and starting to realize one's potential. And I wouldn't disagree at all, is that people that have been through a traumatic experience or cycle like the one in this graphic, I think you're absolutely right. I think that coming out of, and especially these are the folks that I get to meet working in with the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council, all my friends on that consumer advisory board and my heroes, is that there's a strength there that I just want to study somehow. I want to break it down. I want to take it apart. I want to understand it. I want to take it in vitamin form because I want some of that. So I think it's a great point. Trauma changes how we see the world. And it doesn't mean that if you're lucky enough not to experience trauma in your life or your childhood, it doesn't mean you can't be an incredibly strong person. I want to make that pretty clear as well. But I think there's a great point to be had there, is that it is a different life. So it may not be, that you go and get a job at a bank and work the 9 to 5 and have the house in the suburbs. You may want a different type of life for having gone through this experience, which is why so many people are called back in to serve others that are in the abyss. But that's a really good point. It's not like you're just going back like this never happened. You are definitely strengthened by the experience. So excellent point there.
Thanks, Matt. And our next question is, how do antidepressants and mood stabilizers affect the neurotransmitters? Is it similar to the way that substances affect them? And when members of this population get on this type of medication, should they expect to be on them for life? Will they have, for instance, similar withdrawal as getting off a substance if they can't get their medications for 1 month?
Great complex question that I'll try to hit all those points. So in some ways, these drugs, different drugs do different things, and we could do a whole training. There probably is one in the archive somewhere about how antidepressants work, and they prevent uptake, and we could get into all these really complex neurobiology around this. How I look at psychotropic medications from a person who's done a lot of therapy, worked with a lot of people on medication, is that I like to look at that as helping to create a foundation for healing. One of the things, let me flip back here a little bit because this might help me with the brain slide here, is that a lot of times what drugs do is when we look at the brain, again, we know that a lot of people that we're talking about, extreme trauma, addiction, there's a lot more activation in that amygdala area, that red dot in the middle. And so the thalamus takes in the information, a lot more activation in that amygdala. What we know with trauma is certain medication really can help calm the amygdala down. The thing we have to be careful about is somebody living on the street, an overactive amygdala could be actually a good thing. So if their environment, it's really good for them to be hyper alert all the time because they don't know where the next gunshot's going to be coming from, or who's going to steal their stuff, or who might hurt them. That's the real tricky thing here. But let's say we're able to get somebody in a safe housing situation. what I've seen medication be very effective in is a couple things. One is that it sort of quiets and helps somebody gain that emotional regulation that's been damaged or hindered by trauma and addiction. So medication can help send information up through that high road into the cortex. So it can start to help regulate that environment. It also can start to help increase the amount, especially if somebody's starting to experience some sobriety. Again, they've gone through that withdrawal. They're trying to maintain sobriety. Drugs can also start to help balance out the endorphin, the dopamine balance within the brain as well. So some antidepressant medications, when these neurotransmitters are released into the synapse, they prevent the dopamine from being, you can think about when dopamine's released, it's kind of spit out of the one synapse and the other synapse sucks it up, and then the one that spits it out sucks all the remaining backups for the next time when dopamine's released. A lot of antidepressants will prevent that uptake from happening, so more dopamine will be present within the system. So it starts to raise the amount of dopamine anytime receptors are able to take some in. There's more in the environment, not in a hit of cocaine sort of way where it dramatically escalates it, but more in a stable way that builds it gradually over time. Whenever I talk about medications and trauma and addiction, I really like, and this is sort of my personal clinical experience, there may be other people that would argue for a different philosophy. I always like to look at medication as sort of the scaffolding to healing, is that you really want to build a solid foundation for healing and growth. And so medication, too often, especially working with teenagers, we just throw a whole heck of a lot of medication at folks, but we also have to make sure that they're getting other support and services as well. Medication along with, and this is what I see as the foundation of the house, where the drugs help build the house and allow for the emotional regulation to be successful in that building process, but permanent housing, mental health services, substance abuse services, peer support, medical healing that needs to happen. So drugs can really give the emotional regulation for a lot of people in connection to all these other services that allow us to really maintain that healing. So, yeah, I'm not a guy who at all is against medication. I think it can play a really critical role. And in trauma work, we see that. But it has to, again, I always see it as that sort of scaffolding that allows the person to gradually build that house and, again, kind of get back into that normal life. So a key part of many people's healing experiences and journey is some sort of medication. Working with a psychiatrist that gets trauma can be a real life-changing event for a lot of folks. So that's a really, really great question.
Thanks. And our next question is, when working with an addicted client on medical issues or chronic diseases in healthcare, do you think that the addiction needs to be addressed first in order for them to follow through with a medical treatment plan? Often drug treatment beds are full, therefore, how do we keep working with these clients?
And again, I think I just want to throw out another plug for advocacy. If the beds are full, we need more beds. And I know that no one person on the call has the power to do that, but it's heartbreaking to hear that. But I know that that's the reality in basically all of our communities. It depends upon the person in a lot of ways. To get to the question, I do a lot of work in HIV. And I see, and HIV is kind of a tricky chronic disease because of resistance and the power that, I know a lot of clients or patients who have become resistant to medication after remedication because they're not adherent in the way that they need to be. So one of the things I would look for is, can you find a medication, a treatment regimen that fits into their schedule? We never want to do any harm, but trying to find something that fits. So, and I get really practical around this. I have, again, with HIV work, hey, I know one thing you do in your life on a regular basis is get high. Take your HIV medication before you get high. Now, eventually, I hope I have a healthier trigger to remember to take your HIV meds, but I'm looking for anything to get that in there because, again, the inflammation of HIV again, it's just going to hurt the brain and other processes with this. So ideally what would happen is that we would get some stability with the addiction and then build medical treatment on top of that. I know I've got some great providers on the call who have been able to really help people manage chronic diseases while they're living out on the street. I think that's really difficult when you talk about homelessness and addiction, but if we can find a way to do it with the individual patient, I think we should give it a shot if we're not causing harm. But I think we also have to be realistic about our health outcomes as well. And so we never want to do harm. And so if we can try to figure out something, I've been amazed at people, especially in the HIV realm, who have been incredibly successful and hit viral load. They're managing an addiction and experiencing homelessness at the same time. They're able, for whatever reason, to manage HIV when they're struggling in other areas. So in many ways, it's individualized per patient, and we have to be creative, but I would go in with, in many ways, low expectations and hope for the best.
Thanks, Matt. And our next question is there a problem with people being over-medicated and therefore, due to not feeling distress or discomfort, can lose motivation for change?
Absolutely. You know, and I'm not sure, it's hard to say how many folks would fall into this category. You know, and I go back to some of the severe cases I've worked with around mental illness, behavioral problems, especially in late teens. I could barely find the person through the medication. And so one of the things that I did once we established safety and stability is I would work with the psychiatrist, and a lot of the kids I worked with were sort of used to more residential kind of psychiatric settings, is give them a chance to kind of get the drugs out of their system, see what we're really working with, and then find, most of the time what happens, sometimes we would have this whole new person evolve, in some ways blossom in that reality, and they wouldn't have to go back on medication. The vast majority of the times they would get a different diagnosis. Their medications would be most of the time, extremely reduced. And we would have a much easier way to work with somebody in that perspective. So I think we do overly medicate, and a lot of reasons because we just don't know what else to do. Because somebody is willing to take a pill, but they're not willing to go to therapy, mental health treatment. A lot of times the pill might be a better option than nothing. But at the same time, we know that over-medication does happen. I've seen that so much with the kids that I've worked with in the system. And again, when my programs got really good, we created that safety enough to get them off the medication. Again, working highly with psychiatrists. A lot of times that meant residential to make sure that they stayed safe through that process. And we had a lot of success finding the kid within the medication and the diagnosis. Again, most of them got back on some other medication regimen, but a lot of times we saw the number of drugs cut in half, the doses reduced, and it really gave us a much, we had a real kid to work with instead of somebody who was kind of walking around as a zombie. So again, this is why, you know, for me at least, and there's different theories out there, and I really respect that, is medication's that scaffolding. It gives us the ability to help somebody build their own healing journey. And so if there's too much scaffolding, it might be hard to get to that foundation. So I think that's absolutely the case in too many ways.
Thanks, Matt. And I think we have time for one final question during this presentation. So our last question today will be, is the degradation of white matter that you described similar to Alzheimer's disease?
It can be, yes. We know we now have really good proof that stress, I saw this in a work stress study. So you can, you know, trauma is an intense stress, living with high levels of trauma, you can assume that really generalizes to that. But even work stress over time, that cortisol release over time is now being correlated with early onset Alzheimer's disease. That's a great message to take care of yourselves. But absolutely it can be. And so you'll see things like memory loss. You'll see really disorganized verbal talk. That it's hard to sort of follow some people, especially if the addiction's been around for years and decades. Just doesn't. It's kind of hard to follow at times. This is why people not showing up for appointments on time with the populations a lot of times we work with trauma impacts our ability to recall memory. Substances does both short and long term. And I think that that's one of the reasons we see in many of our clinics a high no-show rate or people coming in late. It's one of those real challenges there. But absolutely, we'll see that white matter damage often like it does around Alzheimer's disease. I've kind of started to think this is kind of just me connecting some dots. That recovery from addiction, I've done a lot of reading on recovering from severe stroke and some of the great neuroscience around this. And it seems like what we found is that with a lot of hard work, pretty much the brain can heal itself even from pretty intense strokes. And there's The Brain That Heals Itself is a great book that talks about the work being done in these areas. And for me, it just seemed like, boy, even though the damage is different, recovering from addiction is a lot like recovering from the stroke, is that we're really trying to really figure out how the brain can heal itself, again, with all that damage to gray and white matter. And again, it just shows us why relapse is so prevalent, why really getting into addiction, going through the withdrawal process, gaining sobriety can be so difficult, because it is biologically, it's one of the most challenging things that I've seen in the neuroscience to overcome. Again, the impact's quite different between a stroke and addiction, but the recovery process seems to be, that intensity seems to be there for both. They just kind of struck me in a very powerful way. And with that, before I turn it back over, I just want to thank everybody for your time. These have been great questions as well. Hopefully I gave you some answers. I know this will be reinforced, but I'll get to all questions in written form. And also, if you need a follow-up to your question, but you've got, I'll just throw this up here as we go out here. You'll have my email address and all that in this slide that I will get to, and I want to thank you guys again for all your time, and thanks to the National Council for, again, letting me talk to such a great and wonderful group.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt, and thank you all for joining today's webinar. A link to the archived webinar and the PowerPoint slides will be emailed to all registrants within a few days. As Matt mentioned, questions that he was unable to respond to today will be logged and addressed via email if possible. At the close of this meeting, an online survey to evaluate this webinar will automatically open in your web browser. Please take a moment to complete this survey to help us improve your webinar experience. The fourth and final part in this series, Hope, Transformation, and Post-Traumatic Growth, will be presented on Wednesday, November 2nd at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. Please see our website, www.nhchc.org, for more information. Thank you, and this meeting will now be closed.